As an American in Paris who's personally pretty ambivalent to the existence of Emily in Paris, I feel like I might have a pretty good handle on what makes this show both loved and hated by different camps within the same group of people. Americans in Paris. Here's why they love it, why they hate it, and why, strange as it may sound, I think it actually matters. In case you missed the phenomenon, Emily in Paris is a show on Netflix about an American woman who gets shipped off to Paris at the last minute to cover for a colleague and who ends up enraptured by the magic of the city and deciding to stay. It helps that her lame-ass boyfriend refuses to even visit, but we can talk about the pitfalls of love and moving to Paris on some other video. The show did well enough to earn a second season, which is launching right about now. Which might be why I'm releasing this video right about now. Perhaps closer to the heart of its success than is readily apparent is the fact that it's generated quite the polarizing reception both in France and globally. It is loaded with talent. I love Philippine Leroy-Beaulieu, for example, and is made with the production quality we've come to expect from the big streaming services like Netflix. There are those who love the show and even go so far as to seek to embody it, and yet it's proven divisive, with plenty of detractors along the way. For anyone who has ever lived in Paris, on a budget or no, the cliches and contrasts with real experience start stacking up pretty quickly. There are a lot of videos on these complaints already, but some low-hanging fruit includes the fact that she rents a chambre de bonne, or a maid's chamber, which is at least 3 times bigger than any chambre de bonne I have ever seen, including my own. I live in what is technically a chambre de bonne, and it's a fairly sizable one for being a chambre de bonne, and it's still only 140 square feet, or like 13 square meters. Anyways, she embodies a stereotypical American setting foot on foreign soil for the first time, doesn't speak a lick of French, doesn't seem bothered to try, and ultimately pays no consequences for it. Granted, they seem to be addressing that in the second season, which is good, but just seems like a huge miss for the first season anyways. I don't know, just Control Z that, I guess. And that, I think, is what lies at the foundation of the real struggle with Emily in Paris. She doesn't have to struggle to survive in Paris. And Paris, if you live here, is rife with struggles to survive. Ultimately, the show isn't serious, but should we expect it to be? I mean, we'll dig deeper into that in a minute, but for now, I think we might turn to my friend Lindsay, who wrote an entire book on the women who are moving, shaking, and reshaping the Parisian landscape. And if you need a very, very last minute Christmas present, highly recommend her book, which I have right here, actually. Don't knock the garlands over. The New Parisienne, The Women and Ideas Shaping Paris. It's a really good book. And it's in French now too, and German, I think. I was just gonna ask you.
Oh my god, wow.
Oh my god, wow. I'm curious, I know how you feel about Emily in Paris, but tell me how you feel about Emily in Paris.
Okay, so
and
look.
Why?
All right, so it's coming back for a second season, which I think obviously we don't need, but because of how well it did, of course, Netflix is like ka-ching. My issue with it last year was if you take away the escapism that it clearly offered people who couldn't travel, it perpetuates all of the tired and really damaging cliches about both Americans who grow abroad and of Parisians. And that's, you might say, well, it's part of a fantasy, it's okay, like, don't take it so seriously. Except that when you consider how many cultural projects and artifacts exist that have done the same, have in some way contributed to this narrative, anything that comes out that perpetuates it further, I think is very damaging to the way that Parisians, to be very specific, see themselves, the way people who live in this city see the city, and the way that people from the outside look at Paris. And the other argument that I heard quite a bit was, why can't we just enjoy the fantasy? It's like, my question is rather, why can't more realistic life in Paris be part of the fantasy? Why can't we have some of the very pristine, immaculate, atmospheric shots with a more realistic depiction of daily life? Because it is compelling. And so there's this idea that somehow the myth is the only thing that's compelling, when in fact that is untrue. And when I put this in the sort of lens of everything else that I'm doing to combat stereotypes, Emily in Paris is one big stereotype that maybe has a few redeemable qualities, but for the most part does a real disservice to basically everyone. So all that to say, I don't have high hopes for it. I don't think it's meant to be something of great artistic value, nor will it ever be representative. But I think What I would prefer to see from people who are just glowing in their reviews of it is that they stop and think for 1 minute why it's problematic, why it could be construed as dumbing down a place and reducing a place to a series of mythological characteristics that it can never live up to delivering when you, the traveler, does end up coming here. It just seems like a real waste because the real place is so wonderful and so fascinating.
Good, thanks.
Gotta keep all of it.
I will, every last.
It's a fantasy, baby. Here's the thing. You don't get mad at Friends for putting a bunch of out-of-work actors and baristas in massive apartments in Manhattan. And no one gets angry at Seinfeld for taking taxis instead of the subway, right? There's an element of escapism in Emily in Paris. And I think it hit a lot harder given the pandemic and our inability to go anywhere for so long. There are a lot of people who want to escape the realities of lockdowns and dead-end jobs, not to mention lame boyfriends that won't even join you on a quick trip to Europe. So it may not be my cup of tea, but I can see how it scratches a global itch.
Good, how are you doing? Good. You got to see Emily in Paris early, ahead of time. You had some presuppositions, and in the end, it didn't prove to be what you thought it was going to be.
Yes, I had early access to the first 3 episodes of Emily in Paris about a week before it came out. I was picturing it so different from what it was. So I went through a little bit of like a little bit of a shock. But then I was instantly able to kind of just appreciate it for what it was. You know, I see the real French expat community's critique on this show 100% because it is nothing like living in Paris. And I think when you have been through these struggles, and they are hard, every day of living abroad as an expat is so hard in so many ways. And it's very easy for your friends at home to think like, you live in Paris, how glamorous. And you're like, actually, yes, it is. But it's also horrible and difficult in every way, almost every single day, while it's simultaneously magical and beautiful and amazing. And so to have, you know, the now perception of you live an expat life, you must just be like Emily in Paris. And you're like, no, that's not the real thing. That's not how it goes. So I understand why expats are, you know, angry towards this show. But for me, when I kind of instantly realized this is a fantasy, this is what Gossip Girl's take on New York City was. When I was a college student in New York, when Gossip Girl came out, and was my college, you know, years anything like that? No. But Gossip Girl's not supposed to be a reality show, and I felt the same way about Emily in Paris. It's not supposed to be real. You know, they're in every way, from the way she meets people to the crazy outfit she's wearing that no one would ever wear in Paris. It lets you know this is a fantasy. This is not real life. This is not supposed to be real life. It's a fantasy. And so when you can enter that mindset of this is a fantasy, the same way, you know, Audrey Hepburn's experience in Funny Face in Paris is a fantasy. That's my favorite movie. And so I looked at it in the same way of like, this isn't supposed to be a documentary about what life is really like. It's supposed to be escapism, which I think we all really needed last year when we were confined. We needed to escape. To me, anything that inspires people to want to come or reminds them that Paris is beautiful and amazing and has amazing food and has all these fun things is a good thing ultimately for France. Even if some of the stereotypes are a bit harsh or some of the things are far from realistic, I think the net ends up that you're inspiring people to want to learn more about Paris and visit Paris.
As someone who loves Paris and who had a hard time watching more than 2 episodes of Emily in Paris, I can really appreciate some of what it's doing for the city. Paris is a little like Britney Spears back in the 2000s in that she was beautiful and at the peak of her career among her peers, and then the world just loved watching her fall on her face whenever she might stumble. South Park even made an entire episode about how we like to build celebrities up and then love to tear them down, using Britney as the actual example in that show. And in the same way, then you find a sense of satisfaction in seeing Paris at its worst. It's why in the past there was any form of like pseudo-terrorist attack that happened, I found out through text messages from friends in the US way before I found out locally. The same when Notre Dame caught fire. It was text messages from the US that alerted me. The world news media jumps on any tragedy here before we even know that it's happened. Or look at movies. From the Eiffel Tower collapsing in a dozen films, like G.I. Joe is the one that comes to mind. I don't know why that movie's even in my head. To Liam Neeson's his daughter getting abducted and taken, that's a classic, Paris is more frequently a backdrop for disaster than for romance. At least it feels that way sometimes. And largely because we can't figure out how to convince Owen Wilson to come back. So Owen, if you're watching, please come back. We could use Midnight plus 15 in Paris. I don't know. Like, there's got to be a sequel in there somewhere. Emily in Paris is one of the few Anglo flights of fancy Paris has been given in some time. And I think that that in itself is a real benefit to the image of the city that I love. But even though the fluffy escapism of Emily in Paris as a show ultimately undermines a lot of critiques, why do people still hate it? It's about being seen.
But then let's also get into things more real and as expats share those stories and those moments, which, you know, I always try to do. And I don't know if you know this, Jade, but I actually started dating my upstairs neighbor during confinement.
I did know that.
Everyone was like, oh my God, you're the real life Emily in Paris. And I was like, no, I'm not. Just because I met my neighbor upstairs and started dating him, nothing else about my experience here has been anything like, you know, there is no real life Emily in Paris, because everyone's journey as an expat is also completely different.
Yeah.
You know, of my 3 or 4 really close expat friends, our experience here, the reason we came, how we found our apartment, ended up our job, everything is completely different. And our ups and downs as life as an expat, completely different. They happen at different times, and we're hit with different waves of sadness and challenges, and like, there is no, this is exactly how it is, because it's so different for everyone, that there are these common hardships we all go through, like finding an apartment. But everyone's story of their finding their apartment horror story, because everyone's is a horror story, is so different that there is no, like, there's no way you could ever say this is exactly how it is, or this is exactly how it would go, because so much of it is just a completely different narrative for everybody who lives here.
The thing about life in Paris is that while it may look like a fantasy from the outside, and don't get me wrong, it is great. I love living here. It's also really hard. This is what I think drives a lot of frustration, and why I think I'm not personally all that into the show. Even if you are lucky enough to have a company sponsor your visa or push you through the process of settling in, finding an apartment, getting your residency, the only thing that's truly easy in Paris is finding good bread. And this isn't even necessarily to complain. I signed up for this. I've lived here twice before. Like, I know how outrageously inefficient systems are here.
You don't get the results right away?
No, because it's France. It's gonna take 48 hours.
How the French don't seem to want to take my money, and how the administration will find every chance it can to make me question my worth as a human being. So I know what I'm getting myself into here. I'm more frustrated as a storyteller in seeing how many interesting and all too true facets of life here were simply skipped over. You can't have a good story without conflict, and Paris, as it is rife with conflict. Just try riding your bike across town on a Monday evening, and you'll quickly find this to be very true. And I think that's the thing. Emily in Paris had a chance to highlight so many interesting elements of immigrant life in Paris, city life in general, and chose to overlook or quickly and painlessly resolve things that torment the rest of us for months. What makes this more than a story choice for so many people is how it compounds a sense of isolation in many of us who already struggle to communicate the reality of life in Paris to friends and family back home. And those struggles are even harder for a lot of people if, like Emily, they don't speak French. And I think that's also part of it for a number of the people that I know that really do not like this show. They feel like it missed an opportunity, like there was a chance here for something to exist that would do a great job of demonstrating and dramatizing the real struggles of living here for everybody back home, just so that they would feel seen and understood.
Look, when I wrote The New Paris, it was motivated by a real frustration with the way stories are told about this place.
Yeah.
And Emily in Paris comes around and basically
Hits all the notes.
hits all the notes around Paris being this one-trick pony meant to, you know, basically be a playground for foreigners. And I just don't think we expect that of many other cities. Maybe Rome, but Rome is also messy, and I think that messiness is part of what people enjoy seeing too. There's a little bit of like this Italian chaos that comes through, and that's part of the fantasy. And yet with Paris, it has to be a sleek museum, and you're not supposed to see trash cans or anything else that make it a real functioning metropolis. And I really think that's a shame, because if you stop for a minute to think, well, maybe the real Paris can also live up to my imagination, and show me how wonderful and magical a real place can be. I mean, wouldn't that be something?
One of the things that she highlighted for me that I think about a lot with my frustration for the city is that there are a lot of people that want to keep Paris in a slice of time, whatever that period of time for them, the fantasy of Paris is. And that, I think that's fine to maintain like your fascination with a period in history, the people that you love, the artists, the politicians, whatever it was that drew you to the city first. It's great, but I think it also does the city a disservice not to recognize that it is a moving, living, breathing place that is changing and is growing, and we want to let it express itself. And those of us that live here would really like certain things to change, and if it stays the way it always has been, it won't. And it also seems like it shortchanges the city. It doesn't give it the full credit it deserves for how much it has changed, and it doesn't make it the dynamic world capital that it is.
I did feel like a lot of the people really criticizing it for being so far off from reality. It was just that, like, what I walked away thinking is there is a real space here for the real story, like a much more real and raw, version of events. Like this is clearly interesting to people. So there's this fluff fantasy fun version that's just meant to be entertaining. And to me, it was like, there's clearly a space for like the real, raw, a little bit more difficult, grimy version of this that I think people would want to watch as well. That was definitely something I felt when I saw all the like, this is true, this isn't, this is true, this isn't. And I think too, it's cool to get that topic. I like that topic got started, because I think a lot of times people don't have any idea what it is actually like to be an expat.
Yeah.
And have this romantic idea of it, which, like I said, is true sometimes, it is not true other times. So to have that conversation started, I think is also a cool thing, that it kind of made people want to know a little bit more about like what is that like, and ask questions to learn more and educate themselves more, instead of just assume we're all living our own Emily in Paris version.
At the end of the day, I think the most important thing might just be to recognize that the media that we consume is crafted, shaped, edited for our consumption by someone else. And it's good to ask questions, to think critically, and maybe to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. You don't have to take the Santa Band with a grain of salt, though, I don't think. I think those guys are pretty solid.
What I was also trying to say over the Santa Band was that I recognize that I participate in this as well. I present Paris in a particular way. Whether you're doing it through journalism, books, Instagram, or YouTube, like me, we're all presenting our take on the city in one way or another. And that's why I do think it's important to take all of us with a grain of salt and a little bit of discernment. Just seems important. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks to today's patron producer, Sheri Ashton, for being here, and for all my patrons, as always. If you'd like to become a patron of mine, support the channel. Does a lot of good, keeps me afloat, keeps things sane. I've been testing out different styles of credits at the end here. I don't know which one is best or what. I'm gonna keep playing around with it. But if you want to see your name at the end of the credits, just become a patron. If you'd like to be a patron producer, I randomly select from everybody at the Wanderer level and above. So there's always a chance in there. And thanks, of course, to Lindsay and Anna for participating in this video and just giving me their opinions. It's really nice to get the opinions of some other Americans here who come from different perspectives and I think very different experiences from my own, for sure. So just nice to kind of throw that in there. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. Make sure to give both of them a follow over on Instagram. Leave a comment letting them know that it was the lovely, luscious Jay that sent you. And I'll see you bright and early one of these mornings sometime soon for a post-Christmas, pre-New Year's video. I think I'm gonna make a video about, you guessed it, champagne bottles in the not too distant future, like probably next week. I'll see you for that. Adios.